there is an abandoned railroad hidden somewhere deep in the forest. The depot collapsed decades ago. The tracks have rusted beneath moss and fallen leaves. And according to every map, no train has passed through the valley for over 40 years. But the people who live nearby will tell you something strange. On certain nights, usually in late autumn when the fog settles low across the hills, you can still hear a steam whistle echoing through the trees. And sometimes, a train appears where no train should be. Welcome to Short Ghost Stories, long after midnight. The Ghost Train. Long before the forests reclaimed the valley, a railroad once cut straight through it like a scar of iron. The line ran between dark hills and across a wide basin where fog gathered easily at night. In those days, trains passed through regularly, freight engines hauling timber and coal, passenger cars filled with travelers moving between distant towns. People remembered the sound of those trains more than anything else. The steady thunder of wheels across the valley, the slow hiss of steam drifting over the trees, and the whistle. It could be heard miles away on clear nights, echoing along the slopes like the cry of some enormous mechanical bird. But that was many years ago. The railway was abandoned after a terrible accident late one autumn night, and the small town that once depended on it slowly withdrew into the quiet routine of farms, logging camps, and lonely mountain roads. The depot rotted, the rails rusted, and the forest returned. The town was called Raven Creek. It was not large enough to appear on most maps anymore, but travelers occasionally passed through on their way to other places. The road wound between scattered farmhouses and low hills before disappearing into long stretches of pine forest. Those who lived there rarely spoke about the railroad, yet everyone in Raven Creek knew where the old tracks lay hidden beneath the trees. And most of them avoided that part of the valley after dark. Edward Mallory arrived in Raven Creek on a cold autumn afternoon. He had come on business involving the estate of a distant relative who had owned a small piece of property near the valley. The matter required several signatures and discussions with a local lawyer whose office was little more than a narrow room above the town's general store. The work took longer than Edward expected. By the time the documents were completed, evening shadows had already stretched across the valley floor. Edward had planned to leave town on the evening stagecoach, but a damaged wheel on the road delayed the driver long enough that the coach departed without him. The innkeeper offered him a room for the night. Edward declined. He disliked wasting time in unfamiliar places, and he had been told that another small settlement lay only a few miles beyond the valley. If he walked along the country road, he could reach it before midnight. So he took his lantern and valise and set out alone. At first, the road was clear. Fields spread out on both sides, broken occasionally by split rail fences and small barns leaning in the wind. The last light of day faded beyond the hills, and a pale moon rose slowly above the distant trees. But as Edward walked deeper into the valley, a fog began to form along the ground. It drifted upward from the low marshlands and crept across the fields until the road ahead blurred into a pale gray ribbon. After half an hour, the road reached a fork. One path curved upward into a thick stand of pine trees. The other dipped between two overgrown embankments. Edward hesitated only briefly before choosing the lower road. He walked another 10 minutes before he saw the rusted iron gate. Beyond it lay a narrow cutting through the hillside, and at the bottom of that cutting ran the remains of a railroad track. The rails were nearly hidden beneath moss and fallen leaves. Old wooden ties had cracked and shifted apart. The entire line looked as though it had not been used in decades. To Edward's right stood the remains of a small depot platform. The building itself had long since collapsed, but a narrow shack still stood beside the tracks, and faint light flickered inside its single window. Edward approached the shack and knocked on the door. After several moments, it opened. The man who stood inside was extremely old. His shoulders were bent, his beard white and uneven, and his eyes seemed far too sharp for someone of such advanced age. He held a lantern in one hand and studied Edward carefully before speaking. "You're not from around here," the old man said. "No," Edward replied politely. "I'm afraid I may have taken the wrong road. I was looking for the route to Millstone Crossing." The old man nodded slowly. "You passed it." Edward sighed. "I suspected as much." The man's gaze shifted toward the rails behind him. "You shouldn't be near these tracks tonight," he said quietly. Edward glanced over his shoulder at the rusted line. "Why not?" The old man hesitated. "Because if you hear a whistle," he said at last, "you must not look toward the tracks." Edward allowed himself a faint smile. "That sounds like a ghost story." The old man did not smile. "My name is Calder," he said. Edward nodded. "Mallory." Calder studied him a moment longer before pointing toward the gate. "If you leave now and take the road through the pine grove, you'll find your way back to the main road." Edward thanked him and turned to leave. That was when the rails began to hum. At first, the sound was faint, a thin vibration beneath Edward's boots. Then the iron trembled more strongly. Edward frowned. "What is that?" Calder's expression changed instantly. "Go," he said. Then the whistle came. It echoed through the fog-covered valley like the cry of something enormous and wounded. Edward froze. Far down the tracks, a dim yellow light appeared in the mist. Another light followed beneath it, then another. The lights grew larger, and slowly, the locomotive emerged from the fog. It was an old steam engine, black, heavy, and gleaming with damp. Smoke poured from its chimney and drifted low across the ground. On the front of the engine, a pale metal plate bore the unmistakable shape of a skull. Behind the locomotive came 3 passenger cars. Their windows glowed faintly with yellow light. The train rolled slowly toward the platform and stopped. One of the carriage doors creaked open. Inside sat passengers. They wore clothing from another era: dark coats, long dresses, stiff collars, but something about them was terribly wrong. They did not move naturally. They did not breathe. The woman nearest the door turned her face toward Edward. Her skin was pale beneath streaks of soot. "You're late," she said softly. Edward stepped backward. Then, every passenger turned toward him at once. Their faces were broken, burned, blood-stained. A child held a torn ticket in small blackened fingers and smiled. Before Edward could run, the conductor stepped down from the train. He was tall and thin, dressed in a long railway coat and cap. His face was colorless and his eyes looked dull and empty. "Ticket, please," the conductor said calmly. I don't have one," Edward stammered. The conductor tilted his head slightly. "That's all right," he said. "You've been expected." He seized Edward's arm and pulled him onto the train. The door slammed shut. The whistle sounded again, and the train began to move. Inside the carriage, the passengers sat motionless while the valley slid past the windows. Then Edward looked outside. The landscape had changed. Lanterns flickered along the track. Men shouted in alarm. Smoke rose from twisted iron and broken timber. Another locomotive raced toward them through the fog. Edward understood. He was watching the night of the disaster. The moment when two trains collided on the same track. The passengers turned toward him. "Now you will remember with us," the woman said. The collision came like thunder. Wood shattered, metal screamed, flames burst into the night sky. And Edward Mallory died among them in the wreckage of a disaster that had happened more than 40 years before. The next morning, Calder returned to the abandoned depot. The fog still clung to the valley. The tracks lay silent beneath the trees. There was no sign that a train had passed during the night. But near the platform, he found two things: a shattered lantern and a gentleman's hat. Years passed. The forest continued to swallow the railroad, and the old depot slowly collapsed beneath wind and rain. Travelers rarely came through Raven Creek anymore, but the farms remained scattered across the valley, and the people who lived there knew the forest better than anyone else. They knew how sound traveled through the hills when the fog settled low among the trees. And they knew that sometimes, on cold autumn nights when the moon hung pale above the valley, something still moved along the forgotten railway. No one went to see the tracks after sunset. No one stood beside the old platform anymore. But every now and then, someone would wake in the middle of the night and listen carefully. Because from somewhere deep in the forest, beyond the reach of lantern light or road or town, there sometimes came the long, hollow cry of a steam whistle. And once in a while, you can still hear it blowing through the fog. Well then, you've made it all the way to the end. Some listeners leave early. Some grow uneasy when the night grows too quiet. But you stayed. And if you enjoyed tonight's ghostly tale, feel free to like the video, share it with a fellow night wanderer, and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep the lantern burning. and the story's coming. Thank you for listening. Until we meet again for more short ghost stories, long after midnight.